fire. We're starting a little on the late side, so I'm going to skip a longer introduction to just say, hi, we like to make science accessible. We are every second Thursday, except for one small exception, which I'll also talk about later. And we have some amazing speakers to talk about the science and the art of photography. So I'll have Liam.
Hi, I'm Liam. I'm a Middlebury student. I'm a sophomore, and I am a member of the Middlebury Student Darkroom.
Awesome. And Michelle will also be joining us as a speaker.
I'm Michelle Atheris. I'm assistant professor of photography in the studio art program.
Awesome. Go ahead and take it away.
Okay. This is still sliding in here, so Liam, let's see. Okay.
So I think the first thing that we were going to talk about is like film photography is very much like a chemistry-based scientific process to get everything developed and stuff, but at the same time it's also, I think, more so art, much more so art. And so I think the first thing we were going to talk about is kind of like why we were drawn to film photography, and then for Michelle, why she wanted to teach it. And so for me, I started doing film photography when I came to college because I had a digital camera that was not very good, but I loved doing photography, and so I found that my mom had an old film camera that I discovered I could take much better pictures on than on my digital camera. And from there, I kind of just got hooked on not only the look that it gave, but also the process of developing, and I love going through the process and not really knowing what I'm going to get at the end. One thing I love to do is kind of play around with doing different things when developing my film to see what different products I get. So I think the camera, the better camera, was what originally drew me into doing film photography, and then what kept me there was like the pictures and the product that I was able to produce in the process of doing it.
Yeah, so it's very interesting, like just the maybe generational gap. So I started doing film photography because I had no choice. So it's really interesting to me as a professor now and as a lens-based artist to see the increasing interest and passion that students have for film photography when they have this really clear choice. Right, they can shoot digital, it's fast, it's immediate, but there's something different about the process-oriented nature of film photography that I think is what's driving this renewed popularity in it. So yeah, I actually started off going to school when I was a freshman in college. I was drawing and painting, and then somehow found my way into photography, which is sort of how my story goes. It just kept, someone gave me a camera, then someone gave me a view camera. Like it just sort of, things just kept putting photography in my way, and I just sort of responded to it. And so in undergrad, I needed a job, and I always thought it would be really cool to work at like a photo mat, like a 1 hour photo. I thought that was like the coolest job you could have, so that's what I did. And I worked at a mini lab for a few years, and then eventually worked my way up at the end of undergrad to a custom pro lab and became a master darkroom printer, which is what I did for a couple years between undergrad and grad school. And so because of that, I spent a lot of time in a darkroom. It's a place I really enjoy. Then when I went to school, digital was all the rage, and in graduate school, I focused on digital media and worked in a digital space for a very long time, moved to New York City, didn't have access to a darkroom, worked in a digital space for a very, very long time. And then I came here and ended up with this darkroom that was still in the Johnson building, and found myself reconnecting with film photography and teaching it, which is something I hadn't done in a while. So now I'm back, and here's some coffee. You all should feel free to get up and grab some like mid-talk. And so yeah, so that's where I'm at, and I have to say I really enjoy the students that I have in my film photography classes. They're really excited. They have completely different reasons, different insights into why they're shooting and how they feel about it that for me is exciting and fresh and kind of gets me excited about it again. Yeah, and so I've actually brought some prints, and Liam has brought some of his prints that I guess we'll go through a little bit later. We can talk about what they are, but I brought some prints from some students over. Actually, Levi has some of your prints as well. If you, Levi was in my class last semester, I have some of yours as well. I have a whole box that you all are welcome to check out as we go on. So that's the why.
Yeah.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about the how many people here have shot film on a film camera? Okay. So basically almost everyone. Oh, and you'll get there. And then how many people have then processed in or made prints in a dark room?
Yeah.
It may be like a long time ago, right?
Yeah.
So we thought what might be interesting is to just go ahead and talk about, I can start with a little bit about the technology of like how we got to where we are with cameras. And then I'll hand it over to Liam and he can talk a little bit about the dark room process for those of you who've not been in a dark room or if it's been a while since you've been in there. So I'm gonna attempt to make this work. I'm gonna juggle two laptops. Photography is its connection and, you know, unavoidable linkage with technology. And I'm gonna sort of, one thing that's really interesting to me is sort of the span of technological advancements between where we started and then where we are now, and looking at the spaces and how large and small and compressed they get as time moves on. So this is a diagram of a camera obscura. And a camera obscura is essentially a light-tight black box with a pinhole through it. And when you do that, when you make that pinhole, whatever image is outside of the box will be projected inside the box and invert, right? So you can see this like cone and whatever that cylinder is outside will travel through, the light will travel through a small pinhole and then produce that image on the back. So this phenomenon was noticed by Mo Tzu, who was a Chinese philosopher in 400 BC. It's likely to have been noticed even before that, but he's the first person that like wrote it down. So starting in 400 BC, there is an awareness, right, that this happens. And then if we move into, could you? Yeah. And then we fast forward to the 11th century, right? So now we're like 1,500 years later, right? To Ibn al-Haytham, who is an Egyptian mathematician and astronomer, who really takes this idea of thinking about how light is moving, how it's traveling in straight lines through that hole, creating this this projection inside. And he studies it intently. He's using candles inside and outside of the room. And he essentially invents what's the first like pinhole camera, but without any way to record, right? But he's captured that image in a device. So this is 1,500 years from that initial notation. So just thinking about that large span of time. And so one of the distinguishing characteristics of that camera obscura is that the image is upside down, right? So jumping forward more in history to now 400 years later, mid-1500s, you have an Italian scholar, Giambattista della Porta. And the camera obscura was, at this point, you know, it was known, people were talking about it, but he was sort of obsessed with the idea that why can't we flip the image? Why does the image have to be upside down? So he thought of putting a lens in front of the pinhole to now flip that image upside down. So it basically uses a concave lens to accomplish that. And what's interesting about Della Porta is sort of like a funny story. So he does this, he flips the image, he's so excited, and he decides he's going to use this to make, basically make a performance and treat it kind of like theater. So he invites a bunch of people, he makes a camera obscura in a room, makes his pinhole, puts his lens, invites all these people to come sit in this dark room, and then he has performers outside of the room doing like dancing and whatever. And so their tiny figures were projected on the wall. Everybody in the room freaked out, accused him of like witchcraft, right? Could not understand how he made this happen, and like fled in terror. So it's like this absolute disaster for poor Delaporta. But his contribution is basically that now it's the camera as we know it. So at the same time that the camera obscura is being developed, so after that lens gets fixed on there, the camera obscura becomes an object, right? And it then transforms into the camera lucida, which some of you may know was a drawing tool that painters would use, so that you would be able to get your image, project it onto something, and then trace what you're seeing in real life. So there, I don't know if you remember, I don't know now, like 15, 20 years ago, David Hockney wrote this book, right, about sort of uncovering that a lot of the great masters had used this camera lucida to you know, all of us sat in these drawing classes, these anatomy classes, you know, drawing everything by eye, when in fact they were using these optical tools. But the missing piece in all of this to get us to where we are in the silver gelatin process was the fact that they couldn't hold the image. So in 1717, a German professor by the name of Johann Heinrich Schultz discovered that powdered silver nitrate would darken when it was exposed to light. So he was mostly doing that by doing kind of like stencils, and he would, you know, cast a shadow, it would get, or he would put something down, expose it to light, and then he would see, you know, what was left. But he couldn't fix it in any way. But he figured out that this was a thing, and he documented it. So again, just thinking about starting from 1400 BC, now we're in 1700 AD. So we're, what is that, like 2,000 years thereabouts, in this very long process of technology. And then finally we end up with this image. So this is Joseph Nicephore Niepce, who is credited with making the first photograph. And he was actually really interested in lithography, and he was trying to make plates light sensitive in order to do printmaking. But he sort of discovered that if you could oil an engraving to make it transparent and then put it on a plate, and then you can coat it with a light sensitive solution of bitumen, which is kind of like asphalt, and then also lavender oil, and set it in sunlight for days, hours, right, these very long exposure times, that it would then register that engraving right on there. So this was called heliography, and then what would happen is after a few hours, the engraving would harden, and then you would rinse it away, and you would be left with this image. So this is from this image itself. I'm trying to find the exact date, which I left off this slide. So it's around 1826 that he made this image. And the issue that he had was he could get the image, but he couldn't make it stay, right? So they would degrade over time. The image wasn't fixed. But he was sort of the first to make this big leap. And then around, we're going to move into between 1830s. Then comes somebody named Daguerre, who many of you might have heard of the daguerreotype. And Daguerre was actually a professional scene painter for the theater. And so interesting to see like how people ended up where they were. And he was sort of similarly trying to figure out, like he would use camera obscuras and camera lucidas to try to trace and do big scene painting. And he was trying to figure out a way, how can he retain a duplication of nature without having to sort of hand paint everything. So he heard about what Niepce was doing, and they partnered up. And basically, they started to, what Daguerre did was he shortened the exposure time necessary, because he figured out that you could expose a plate without processing it and get a latent image, right? So a latent image is just something that's been exposed that hasn't been processed. So when we shoot something on our cameras, before we process it, it's still a latent image. So they worked together, and he was starting to use iodized silver to make plates, and then where it could be like, quote, developed with like mercury vapors. And then in 1837, he's able to fix the image permanently. So he sort of took what Niepce was doing and built off of it. And then you will hear a lot about daguerreotypes, which are essentially like a silver copper plate. And so has anyone ever seen a daguerreotype? I wish I had. I should have asked Special Collections to let me borrow one. But they look like they almost look like they're mirrored, so you can see the image on there. But that's that copper plate that's underneath there. So the last. So when people talk about photography, you'll sometimes hear it referred into eras like the plate era, the print era, and then the digital era. So right now we're still very much in the plate era. But then, sort of concurrently, over in England, you have William Henry Fox Talbot, who's also trying to figure out how to get images from real life onto a piece of paper. So he's actually working, like Daguerre and Niepce were working together. Talbot is not. He's on his own thing, and in fact, he had done most of his research before he knew what Daguerre was doing. So basically, he was a scientist at University of Cambridge, and he couldn't draw his scientific observations, and he was really frustrated by this fact. So that's why, and he had a camera lucida, still couldn't do it. He was a terrible draftsman. So that's what was pushing him to go forward and sort of investigate the photographic process. So what he did something a little bit different. So in 1835, he was using paper to make paper light sensitive by soaking it alternately in solutions of common salt and silver nitrate. And basically, what would happen is silver chloride would be produced in the fibers of the paper, and he would then expose that to light, and he would get a paper negative. He would take that paper negative, put it against another light-sensitized piece of paper, expose that, and then you could get a positive. Right, so he's working with these two paper products. So he starts the print era because he's able to work on paper. So, his values were a little bit more subtle. I mean, this is This is sort of a bad image of a daguerreotype. They're really a little bit more subtle in the tonal values and the grays. But you'll notice with Talbot, you can really see how much definition he's getting in there. So let me go back here. So essentially, the problem that he was having was also with fixing the print. So after he would get his print, he was washing it in a strong solution of sodium chloride, and it wasn't adequate, which meant the image was fading, it was going away, it was getting washed out. And then eventually his friend, Sir John Herschel, who's an astronomer, suggested that he fix the negatives in sodium hyposulfate and then waxing them before printing in order to reduce the grain of the paper, which worked for him. And so he was able to get stable prints from that. So Daguerre's process reached England like news of what he was doing in 1839. So Talbot was like, oh no, I have to stake my claim on photography. So he rushed, he made a publication of his photogenic drawing, he called it, and then was able, I think he was actually able to get his process to members of the Royal Society like 6 months before Daguerre, so he beat him to the punch. But what we would call this is a calotype. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, and then because this goes into talking about specific photographers. But Liam, do you want to talk a little bit about like what happens in the
yeah, I can do my best. I'll preface this by saying that I'm like, it's funny, I am a STEM major, but I don't actually know a ton about like the hard science behind developing film, because I kind of just go in and do it, but I can do my best, and then Michelle can, you can fill in whenever you please.
Yeah, so I'll back check you. How about before you go?
Yeah, so basically it starts with cameras, like the ones you see over there, and we have two types of cameras here. There's a 35mm camera, which is this one
It looks
here.
pretty familiar.
Very
Is there film
familiar.
in any of these?
No, there isn't. You can open them up, I think. Yeah. So that's the inside. You can see that's the shutter right there. in the center of it. And so it starts with the camera, and you put film in the camera, and the film is, it's a silver gelatin film, so the particles are light sensitive. And so the first thing you do is you expose the film to light, and you do that through the camera, and then that image is, what was the word you used for it?
Latent.
Latent.
So it's exposed but not processed.
It's a latent image.
Yeah.
And so basically the other type of camera there is a 120 millimeter film camera, and or 120 camera. It's medium format. And this is the part that I think I'm right on, which is that it essentially just correlates to the sensor size of the camera. So
it's the size of the film.
The film, yes.
Yeah.
The film acts like a sensor would in a digital camera.
Right.
So
yes. So if a 35 millimeter film is a 10 megapixel sensor in digital, then 120 would be a 20 megapixel sensor. So basically, the film is larger. So you get less grain. You can make larger prints from it without having the grain be visible or get in the way of the image.
Yeah. So after we have the latent image, we go into the darkroom, and at this point, I think a lot of times this is like a misconception I had when first going into film photography, which all of you probably know, which is that the red lights, you can't have the red lights on when you're taking the film out of the camera. That will wreck the film. The red lights are just for printing. So this part is done in complete darkness, where you take the film, you will rewind the film, and then you take the roll, you take the film out, and then in the darkness you roll it onto a spool. And then you put the spool into a light-sensitive container, or light-proof, light-proof container, which then we put chemicals into to develop it. And so the first chemical we put in is the developer. Do you want to talk about what the developer actually does? Because I won't do a great job.
So the way that silver gelatin, modern film, or silver gelatin, the way that film works is you have a plastic substrate, and then there's a coating of gelatin, and inside of that gelatin coating are silver nitrate, like light-sensitive silver particles. When you let light, it's the same thing that Schultz discovered, right? When light hits some of those particles, they change. So you take your image, it exposes those particles, and what developer does is it basically particles that are exposed to light become lighter, right? And darker, and particles that are not exposed to light become darker, so to speak, right? They become activated. The developer basically is what brings that up to temperature and causes that chemical reaction in the film. The next step is?
After that, you wash the film off, because if you don't wash the film off after with just water, then the developing will kind of continue to happen. But after the quick wash, you do fix it.
Well,
Am I wrong? I might have been wrong. I might be totally wrong.
Just bring my very anal retentive like lab stuff. So after the fixer or after the developer, you do need to stop the developing process. So the way you decide how long you develop is there are developing charts that are made by the chemistry producer that lets you know, like, you're using this type of film. Your developer is at this temperature, so you should develop it for 13 minutes. Right, so you leave the developer on for 13 minutes in the tank, and then you can use water. You can also use stop bath, which is another chemical. It's essentially vinegar, yes?
I was going to say, did different brands of film, like a Polaroid versus Fuji, I guess, like have different properties? Yeah, different development times?
For sure. Yeah, different levels of contrast, different grain size, different developing time. Are there two films that ever have the same developing time? I don't know. Some. But usually it's for whatever chemistry you're using will publish some kind of chart that gives you a guide. The developer is sort of the second part in making that image. So first is like you're composing it, you're doing the fun thing in the camera, but now you have to make sure that if you overdevelop your images, your negatives will come out very dense and very dark and hard to print. If you underdevelop, you're not going to retain as much information on the film itself, which we've all done.
Yes, absolutely.
Very much. I feel like students in the class, it's a good lesson in failure and being okay with making mistakes and sort of like, oh, that's gone for good and that's what happens, and just learning through doing, experiential learning, I think, as the college likes to say. So you do stop at, and then the next one is?
The next one is the fixer. And fixing, I don't think fixing really differs based on film type, does it?
No, only develop.
You just fix for 5 minutes, and what the fixer does is the developed image, the film can still degrade, right? It's not set yet, and the fixer makes it light safe. So it's fine to take it out in light. I have a binder full of negatives there that have been exposed to light for some of them over a year now, and they still look exactly the same as when I developed them. So do you want to go into what the fixer actually does?
Yeah, so what the fixer is doing, so all of the chemistry in a black and white darkroom is relatively safe. I mean, I wouldn't drink it, but I've certainly had it on my hands for many years, and I'm mostly okay. But the fixer, out of all of them, when we run the darkrooms, that's the one that we have to take the most care and disposal. And the reason for that is when you put the film in the fixer, now what it's doing is those silver particles that are not sticking to the emulsion have to go somewhere. And the fixer is loosening them, drawing them off of the film base itself, and then that silver is sitting inside that chemistry. So we have to, basically what we do is we filter it, get all the silver particles out. But a fixer gets all that silver that's not necessary off the film, but it also hardens that gelatin surface. So thereby making it archival, meaning that your picture is not going to degrade. If you overfix or underfix, you might see your emulsion flaking off, you might see your film turning various colors that you don't want it to, or just darkening over time. Yes?
Is the silver gelatin sort of like the best mixture of of goodness and least expensive, or like why has silver gelatin sort of become the thing, and why not?
So as opposed to like a color process?
Sure, yeah.
So there are 3 different dominant photo processes chemistry-wise. So there's silver gelatin, which is black and white. There's C41, which is color processing, color negative film, and then there's E6 processing, which is color slide film, like a color positive film. And for the black and white is the most forgiving of all the chemistry, and C41 and E6, the company right now is sort of, again, there's this big revival, so there's lots of people wanting to set up darkrooms at home and process their own film. And with color film in particular, the chemistry has to be held at really precise temperatures, or else it's just destroyed. So in order to do that, as an amateur in a small setting, you need some sort of machinery or some sort of equipment to help you hold that chemistry. And there's something called a jobo when I was in school that you would use to process color negatives. I don't mess with it. I find it's like slightly more toxic. There's a bleach phase that you enter into it, but it takes a really long time and is expensive. So black and white is fine, and I think it's really just ease of use and I guess cost. At this point, all the film's really expensive. So just if you haven't bought a roll of film in a long time, think about the last roll of film you bought and maybe how much you paid for it. And right now, T-Max 400 black and white is $10.99 a roll. So back in school, it's like $1 a roll, if that. So the inflation, and same thing with the chemistry. Kodak, they had a developer called D76, which is really popular, kind of standard. They stopped making it. They stopped in Japan, and then now that's finally hit here. I do have some hoarded that I've been donating to the Darkroom Club. But so because the large commercial industry has really gone away with digital, but there's a really vibrant hobby community, you're just seeing this really kind of like out of kilter pricing with materials and things disappearing, and then new people making film, just weird brands you've never heard of who are producing all this film. Yes?
So when I was in college, there was this sort of development, but of digital film into print, like a conversion.
You would make negatives and print them?
We didn't do it, but the faculty did. I never watched how they did it. Is that something that goes on?
You can make a digital negative. Essentially, you would take your image in on your computer. If you're doing it in a black and white sense, you would make it, you take it in Photoshop, you would invert it, and then print it on transparency. So you use a similar process to make like cyanotypes
Yeah.
And there's other like alternative process where you make your own negative and then you can use black and white paper. Or you can use like cyanotape, which is that blue paper, like sun print, sun paper. Yeah, that's actually relatively easy to do if you just, all you do is transparency inkjet paper.
Awesome.
So we put the fixer,
With the fixer.
then you wash it.
After fixer, you do, water or, I just use water. We don't have any stop baths or anything like that in the darkroom. We just use water for everything because it's just added cost and it's more complicated. We use water, and then after that, you dry the film off. And I think the part that I actually see like the most people mess up in when I do workshops in the darkroom is actually after they've developed the film, they forget that the film is still really fragile, like even after it's developed. And you know, it's so easy to scratch film, or a lot of the time film will end up getting like watermarks on it when you dry it, and you know, getting those watermarks off without scratching it can be really difficult. And so just knowing that, like, you know, even after you fix it, it's no longer light sensitive, but it's still a very fragile piece of art and science that you have to really take care of.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well. Like the students just sort of, I mean, most of the students in my class have never printed a photograph, like even their own, like even a 4x6. Why would they? Right? They take pictures on their phone, or they keep it in their phone. So, you know, prior to taking this class, like how many of your photographs that you're just taking are you really printing? It's expensive, but it's just so different from when that's all we did was waste paper and print, right? So, so to think about photography or photographs as a material process rather than a screen-based one, I see something, I take a picture, it lives in my phone, is really different. For students. And so that's been something that I think a lot of them really engage with, you know, but there's some frustration with ripped film, fingerprints everywhere, just getting used to the delicate nature of it.
Yeah, and then after you develop the film, then we have over here is the prints.
Yes.
Which this also kind of goes into like the being careful with your film thing is, you know, when you're printing something, you're enlarging it onto a larger piece of paper. So this afternoon, I very much rushed and made some not so great 11 by 14 prints, but you can see like the 11 by 14 prints are coming off of a piece of a negative that's this big. So, you know, I'm blowing it up to, you know, whatever it is, like 80 times the area of what it is. So if there's any scratch or mark in the film, when I put it in there, it's gonna get blown up by a lot. But negatives are a really similar process. So we have these, you can think of them like a projector if you've never used them. They're called enlargers. And you put a negative into this holder, and then it shines a light through the negative and projects the image down below. And so after you go through the process of focusing it, we usually do what's called a test strip, where we take a piece of the photosensitive paper we use. And I should explain the process before I do this. Basically, you project the image onto a piece of photosensitive paper. So if you take the negative, the darker parts of the negative are going to end up being lighter in the end. Is that right? That's correct, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I sometimes mix that one
So
up.
it is easy actually to, yes.
To switch the whole positive and negative
I always
thing.
have sometimes
So
like,
if you think about it, when you shine the light through, the darker parts of the film are going to absorb more light. They're going to let less through, and so then less photons are going to hit that the photosensitive paper. So where more photons hit on the lighter parts of the negative, it'll end up being darker on the paper. And so the first thing we do is paper, just like film, has to be exposed right, and it has to be developed right. So in its own sense, the paper is a little bit like, it is like a sensor. So we'll do a test strip to gauge how long we should we should expose the paper for. And you do that by taking a little strip of the paper and covering most of it and going down and exposing a little bit more each time. And so what you get by that is you get a strip where on one end you might have an exposure that's 6 seconds, and on the other end you have an exposure that's 1 second. And it can be any interval, it doesn't really matter. But what you get by that is you get to see what your picture looks like at each different interval of time. And then from doing that, then you get to gauge, then you get to decide how long you're going to expose your piece of paper for. Yeah, and there it's pretty much the same process. I don't know the difference between paper developer and film developer.
It's a different chemical, and then the fixer is usually a different dilution. But it's the same process, like the developer is not that fixer. And so within both of those, so either in the developing of the film or in the printing itself, that's where sort of the process-oriented nature of film photography becomes something that I think is really special. And I brought an example of a student from my class last semester who was doing something called pushing film. And so what pushing film means, so all films have an ISO or a speed to them. So it would be like 100, 400, 800. The smaller the number, the slower the film, meaning the more light sensitive it is, or pardon me, the less light sensitive it is and the finer the grain. The higher the number, the more light sensitive it is, but more heavy, big grain. And I'll just like pass, I'm going to pass this image around. So these two in particular, if you can just go ahead and look at them. And so what this student did, it was 400 speed film, but he shot it at 800 on his camera, and then he developed it, he pushed it one stop, which meant that he's sort of treating this 400 speed film like 800 speed film, which allows him to shoot in low light, right, to have lower light, but it also does this thing to the grain where it becomes really prominent. And he does these he's photographing in Northern California, so it's like these really beautiful like beach scenes, and I just feel like that grain was a really inspired choice, like that kind of process for that subject matter of that. And so that's the thing, I think, within film photography. In digital, you can go in Photoshop and you can do all sorts of things, but there's something about that chemical process and sort of not knowing how it's going to come out, right, and experimenting, and then seeing, and this is like his signature move. I think he does this all the time. He uses what particular kind of film. Yeah, that's his thing. So copyright, Kai on this process, but I think it's used to great effect, and that's something that I think, you hear a lot like, photography was going to kill painting, and now like AI is going to kill photography, right? You hear these sort of predictions and ideas about how one technology will just consume another, but it's things like this, and it's ways that people are still finding within the process to keep it fresh and relevant and new and engaging for like audiences and artists themselves. I have a slideshow of, you have some photographs you want to show.
Photos too, but you can show yours if you want, I can show mine.
I can do them really quickly. Are yours or your photographs?
They're all mine.
They're all yours. So maybe that makes sense.
Okay.
Let me just whip through these and then we'll do yours, and then I'm going to do just a very fast lecture. I just want to show a couple of photographers who I think were either key in, can you unblock your, sorry, key in advancing photography as an art form and sort of moving it beyond just like a technological process, right? And I think that's what ultimately will save photography, is that it has this whole other utility as an art form and expression that goes beyond just the fact that you can like take a picture of something and have it look like your life. So this is Alfred Stieglitz. And Alfred Stieglitz is just a seminal figure in photography for many, many reasons. We could do 5 lectures on him, but we keep it short and sweet. So he was born in 1864, and he went to Berlin in the 1880s and studied photography. He returned to the U.S. in 1890, and he after being in Europe and being around a lot of avant-garde European artists, he felt very strongly that photography should be treated as art. At the time, it was really being used as you were making portraits, it was scientific, but it did not hold any major position in, quote, the art world. It was not seen as on the same level as photography, as painting or sculpture. And so he started 2 publications, Camera Notes and Camera Work, and he became a critic. He was an art critic, he was a dealer, he was a photographer and a writer, and he started really pushing this theory, these ideas that photography should be regarded as art and not just a piece of technology. He formed a group called Photo Secession, which is an organization of photographers who felt the same way. So this is an image, so he also started a gallery. This is an image from the gallery, and its full name was called Little Galleries of the Photo Secession, but it was commonly known as 291, named after its address is 291 Fifth Avenue in New York City. So this is an image out of the back. He ran that gallery, he showed a lot of photographers, again, the same way he would show artists. But then he was also bringing over avant-garde European artists like Matisse, Picasso, Brancusi, Rodin, Duchamp, who were not quite in the U.S. at that time, and he was sort of merging the two, right? So he was smart. And he was also married to Georgia O'Keeffe, so that might be why you might have seen his name crop up. And Georgia O'Keeffe, obviously a famous painter, they had kind of a May-December relationship, so there's lots of scandal. There's a book of their letters they wrote to each other. The relationship was complicated, as most are. But what's interesting is he started photographing her. This is at the beginning of their relationship, and the kinds of photographs he's making, you can even see he's doing some sort of standard portraiture, but then just photographing her hand, which at the time was not that common, right? He was really elevating into a place of poetry. And then, so this is from, just to give you some sense, this is from 1918. The one on the left is a palladium print, and the one on the right is a platinum print. Both are sort of precursors to the silver gelatin. I can expound on that later if anyone's interested. And then now this is, in 1933, a gelatin silver print. It's really interesting if you look at all of his portraits of her. You can see not only how she changes and ages, but you can see how their relationship changes, right? There's definitely like a kind of distance. There was a time when they were living apart. It's fascinating. I recommend you check that out on your own. The other thing that he did, though, so he had a really famous series called Equivalence. This is from 1925. It's a gelatin silver print. And what he started doing is he started photographing the sky. So he just started photographing clouds in the sky and releasing them with no location data. So what he was trying to do was to separate photography from its like documentary use into a poetic use. And he believed that photography could function like music. So in a way, he was sort of influenced, I think, by Kandinsky, right, with this idea that photography was something else, right? It was about form. It could talk about an emotional state. It wasn't just simply like, here's a tree in, Yosemite National Park. So he's really, really trying to divorce that. And he made hundreds of these. Interestingly, he made most of them. He had a house in Lake George, so not too far from here. And he would spend the summers photographing the sky in Lake George. I mean, there's I have a bunch of quotes, there are a lot of great quotes there, but I'm going to zip through so that you can have some time. The other person I want to mention is Minor White. And I'm going to show some more historical and uses of photography or people who I felt advanced as an art form. And then I'm going to show a handful of photographers who are sort of pushing and utilizing the process of photography, specifically silver gelatin, in a contemporary way. So this is Minor White. He was born in Minnesota. He started the magazine Aperture, if anyone's familiar with that, which is still operational today. It's a sort of the photography magazine where he was writing about photographs, he was showing photographs. He started that with Ansel Adams, excuse me, and Dorothea Lange actually in 1952. A lot of these photographers, when you look at their bio, he was a botany major and then dropped out of college to become a poet and then started doing photography. I can list like 50 photographers who were all like scientists of some sort, and then at some point in their life they were just, and now I'm a photographer. Elliot Furnace Porter is another one. So with, what just lost my rubber band. With Minor White, he was a big fan of Stieglitz, and he was again thinking about making photography akin to poetry. So the title of this work is from 1948. It's called Abstraction, the Bird with the Misplaced Heart, right? Because of this shape of the bird. So they're sort of funny, they're a little off kilter, but they're very much about metaphorical thinking, right? Here's another one. This is 1959, Peeled Paint, Rochester, New York. This is another one. He actually did make a lot of photographs in national parks for all of his sort of poetic abstract work. He did do a lot for the National Park Service and tried to advance an interest similar to Ansel Adams, right? There are a lot of photographers working with parks departments to try to garner support and interest for those spaces. But this is one called Bullet Holes, and it's Capitol Reef, Utah. So it's where somebody had been, I guess, like shooting through this rock formation. And then sort of matching that, this is called Untitled 1962. I suspect he has a lot of pictures of like frost on windows, which I thought was sort of apt. There should be frost on our windows right now, I guess. But also a lot of stuff made in Rochester. So the next few people I'm going to show, and then I'm going to hand it over to you. This is Abelardo Morel. He's a contemporary photographer who makes camera obscuras in hotel rooms, and then photographs the inside of the hotel room. So this one is in Manhattan. These are from 1996. He also created something called a tent camera, where he basically makes a camera obscura, points it at the ground, and then photographs the ground. So this is Sunflower Field in Arles, France, 2022. This is his recent work. This is another one. So that same concept, right? This is the camera obscura again, but now sort of updated. Another artist working with camera obscura is Vera Luder. So these are 55-inch prints. The museum actually owns one of these. So keep an eye out next time you're at the museum. They don't get it out enough, I think, but it's beautiful. She does something similar to Millardo, but what she does is she actually puts a piece of photographic paper on the wall. And sometimes her exposures can take months, days. And sometimes she'll get old shipping containers and make camera obscuras out of those. And she generally stays inside. She has like a light type tunnel that lets her go in and out. But she likes to sit inside while it's being exposed because it makes her happy. So that's her quote. Sweet. This is the Athena, Temple of Athena. And that's just the scale of those prints. So that's her scale. And then Hiroshi Sugimoto, and it might be where I stop and hand it over to you. Hiroshi Sugimoto is a Japanese photographer and architect. He's one of my favorites. I could talk about him all day. But he did this project called Lightning Fields, where, so sometimes it's a thing in the darkroom where if you're in a really dry place, static electricity can get onto your film when you're loading it, and then will cause, issues because there's light happening there. And so Sugimoto was thinking about that. It's particularly with like 4x5 large format cameras, it's a problem. So what he decided to do was to essentially make photograms where he would connect, a 4,000 volt generator to apply electrical charge directly onto film and then process what happens. So this is actually like electricity that he's captured by shocking the film itself. They're amazing. And then this is another project of his called Seascapes, and sort of similar to Vera Luder, these are super long exposures where he's just photographing the sea and the horizon. And he does it at different locations. And these are stunning. They're about 20 by 24. They're fairly large. The museum also owns several Sugimoto pieces. that you should, you know, if you are there, check out. So I'm going to stop here. Even though this is not holiest break, but I'm going to give you a chance to.
We don't have a ton of time. Do we have is anyone using the room after this?
You got a couple minutes.
Okay.
Let's let you go at 6:30. You got 5.
So if people need to leave, go ahead. If you want to stick around, I can stick around for a few extra minutes. Yeah. Basically, whatever pleases you. So I currently have done all but a little bit of my shooting on that 35mm camera over there, which is a Pentax Spotmatic F. I think it's from 1974, 5, I want to say. So it's pretty old. It's definitely a lot older than I am. So
How old is that?
Are
we talking like 95 or like what?
I'll just show some of the stuff that I've shot. I don't, a lot of this I haven't actually ever shown to anyone before, really. But I don't know, I like to take pictures mainly. So this was at a bike race I took pictures at last spring up in northern Vermont. This is my friends. We were in Shenandoah National Park on the road trip. I had very fun memories from that. This is one from the first roll of film I ever shot, so that's kind of an exciting picture for me. This is actually near where Kai lives in Northern California, and it's just beautiful. And then White Mountains. I took my film camera to San Francisco last fall, and there's so much stuff in San Francisco that's worth taking pictures of on a film camera. It's really incredible. This is one you can see very scratched, like somehow got really, really scratched, but this is California, Central Coast. Same with this. My friend Gavin, I can cut some of the newer stuff here. This is a car I liked in San Francisco. This is the skyline in the baseball stadium. But I do all black and white, except for a couple rolls that I've shot in color and have finally gotten back. I would say that there's a good reason for it, but it's really just more what I'm comfortable with and what I've done more of. The darkroom didn't have any color developing stuff last year, so I was kind of confined to black and white if I wanted to do it myself. So no, this is this roll I shot from this summer, and about halfway through the summer I realized that I had these 2 rolls that I'd shot. I drove out to California on my trip, and they'd been sitting in my car all summer. And where I was in California, it typically got up to about 95 degrees during the day, which in a car means it's about 130. And film does not like to be hot. It actually likes to be cold. That's why typically you refrigerate film if you want to preserve it. So I ended up with these 2 rolls of film where a lot of the pictures didn't fully come out, but some of them did come out, and the ones that did come out had really, really great contrast. Some of them had, you can see this one, just massive grain, but I ended up loving the contrast throughout, like the clouds and stuff. I haven't been able to capture like clouds like that before. And this is kind of one of the ones that didn't fully turn out. I felt like it was kind of just feels like it felt a little bit fried when I looked at it, but I still don't mind it. It's my friend Lucas. And yeah, again, you can see with this one, like this one got fried, and it's just really, really large grain, but I think that it ended up having good contrast and depth to it. So I think, going forward, one thing that I'd really like to do is shoot a roll of film and then kind of blast it with a hairdryer for a few minutes and see what happens. This is my dad.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's amazing.
Oh yeah, let's get that one. But yeah, I think that, I'm one thing that I'm a big believer in is a lot of people say, like nowadays that I hear like younger people who get into film, like, I like film because of the aesthetic of it, and I think people think that film is, a lot of people think or take film pictures so that they're grungy or seem like, you know, film has this quality to it where no matter like the quality of the picture that you take, it still feels kind of like special. But I am like very much against the idea of like purposefully taking bad pictures on film just for the aesthetic. Like, I think that film should be like treated with respect, just like a digital camera. And so I don't think that I would want to purposefully take a picture that had like really large grain size or was blurry, but sometimes it happens accidentally and you realize that it's actually looks fairly good. So going back to that one. This is one of the color bowls that I just got back. Violet back there developed it for me. It looked great. But this roll of film is from 1995, I think, and was unrefrigerated for the past 25 years. So not terrible. Wasn't really expecting what I'd get, but this was actually a couple days ago in California that I took this. It was just south of Death Valley, and there's so many mountains and layers to the mountains. And I pushed this roll of film. It was 400 film, and I pushed it to 800, which was actually my first time doing that. The grain came out a little bit, but I don't mind it. I think it looks all right. This one, the grain is really, really large, which not exactly sure why, but just some more. It is past 6:30 now, so you guys.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and we'll thank our speakers, and then people can stick around.
Yeah.
I'll answer questions.
Thank you.
So thank you all for coming. I will shamelessly plug that we're having our next Science Cafe on the 3rd Thursday in February. There's a break in the middle. So come join us for our next cafe. We'll sort of send out some more information through social media and our email list if you want to hear about what it is. If you're not on those, come talk to us. We'll get you set up. Feel free to help yourself to what's left, and feel free to stick around and ask questions. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you.